Let's compare the 4 tanks of Final Fantasy XIV. If you already know you want to main a tank, then this might serve to help you choose, or alternatively teach you what you don't want. Or maybe you just want to hear about the pros and cons of each tank, combined with a bit of comedy, in which case you have also come to the right place. Please keep in mind that this video may be slightly opinionated, especially in the ratings shown for each job. So, if you feel that I missed something or that you disagree, I would love to hear about it or about your favorite tank in the comments. Now then, let's begin with the Paladin filling the classic sword and board tank style, complete with a chance to block physical attacks for some extra damage reduction every now and then. For the first many levels, the Paladin feels a lot more like just the gladiator than a Paladin, having absolutely no magic spells to speak of until level 58, after which the magic arsenal is gradually filled out. The general playstyle of the Paladin starts simply by making the most of the fight or flight buff, with the most complex part being learning the concept called Lateweaving to fit an extra oGCD within the buff. As you reach the higher levels, the magic burst starts filling out more and more of the rotation, as well as being more valuable for your potential damage, capping out at taking up a third of your rotation, making the Paladin the closest we have to both a mage tank and a ranged tank. Due to how rigid the Paladin rotation is, the hardest part about learning it is mastering the ability to perform the sequence that matches your skill speed reliably, and knowing what skills to skip in case of downtimes to make sure everything lines up properly again. Because of this extremely rigid playstyle, the Paladin, uniquely among the tanks, has 2 significantly different rotations to work with depending on how much skill speed you have, namely Slow Paladin and Fast Paladin, with some extra details to each for particularly slow or fast skill speed amounts. Indeed, uniquely for the Paladin, you need to be acutely aware of your skill speed when playing to be able to perform optimally. An interesting aspect in the Paladin's rotation is that due to fight or flight boosting the damage of Intervene, it is considered optimal to only use this attack during this buff, while the magic burst is entirely ranged, which means that your physical burst, fight or flight, is the time where you are the most mobile, while the magic burst is when you can get away with staying far away from your targets if needed. Between these 2 bursts, you have a downtime phase waiting for the next cooldown to get ready, which takes up around a fourth of your rotation. In terms of defense, the Paladin has access to some of the strongest options, however, most of them come with some sort of downside to them. Shelter, Intervention, and Cover rely on a resource that is only generated from auto attacks, so bosses with significant downtime can cause problems with these tools. Cover additionally uniquely allows the Paladin to force damage onto them. However, this comes at the cost that Intervention is slightly weaker than all the equivalent options of the other tanks. Either you use the weakest off-tank tool or the excessively strongest. Similarly, Hallowed Ground is the ultimate invulnerability tool, but it also has the longest cooldown. Divine Veil is a very strong raid cooldown, but it requires someone to cast a heal on you to activate. And generally, Passage of Arms cannot be used without stopping your attack and movement. However, you can apply it for 5 seconds on the players immediately behind you by activating it for just a moment. Additionally, while it isn't exactly a defensive cooldown, Clemency can be used as extra healing in a tight spot, although in most cases, as it is a damage loss to use at all, it is recommended to not use it unless absolutely critical. Perhaps the most complicated part of the Paladin may be their openers, where the Slow Paladin relies on just one, but the Fast Paladin has both a fast opener that is a bit less optimal, and then there is the ridiculous 18-second early fight or flight opener, designed to circumvent the rigidity of the Paladin rotation by simply starting the quote-unquote rotation without performing it, such that things line up properly later, while also lining up your magic burst with raid cooldowns. There's not really a joke here. I feel this silly opener is wild enough in its own right. Next up, we have Warrior, sometimes jokingly called the green tank due to the absolutely massive healing it is capable of providing. For the first many levels of the job, the main focus is on making the most of the 3 attacks in the Berserk window, which can be difficult since it both depends on resource management and planning, since you don't want to delay the cooldown too much to make that magic happen. Optimizing this can be very difficult to master, however, at level 70 you can completely forget about it since Inner Release makes the best options free and the only options. Most of the strongest attacks in the warrior's arsenal automatically maximize their damage by being guaranteed critical direct hits. But as the stats associated with this add to the damage of such attacks, it simply means the warrior is capable of reliably doing some absolutely massive hits, especially for a tank. Due to this style, the warrior is heavily focused on GCD damage and has very little in terms of oGCD options, having only their charge, onslaught and upheaval or orogeny. As such, as you reach higher levels, the main complexity of the job goes into planning your uses of Infuriate and general beast gauge spending within timeframes where your party is applying raid buffs to get more value out of it. Due to this sort of simplicity, you can focus more on timing your defensive tools as you need. In fact, while the Paladin aims to master Lateweaving for damage reasons, the warrior aims to master it for defensive reasons. Raw Intuition and Bloodwetting, as well as the shared Nascent Flash, all have the capability to fit an extra GCD to heal with if you lateweave it well. But as they are also defensive cooldowns, you need to both lateweave it while simultaneously timing it early enough to be able to benefit from the damage reduction for the incoming attack, which can make the optimal window even tighter than for Paladins. Now, Bloodwetting and Nascent Flash are the sources of the green tank nicknames, as they make the warrior able to heal for amounts rivaling an actual healer. And the fact that they also have Shake It Off, Equilibrium and Thrill of Battle only makes it even better. While the Paladin has access to Clemency for strong healing as a last resort, the warrior does even more healing just as a side product. Most of the warrior's extra cooldowns relate to healing itself, which means that timing your strong defensive options well can at times completely remove the need for a healer to top you up after a big attack. Disclaimer, this does not always reliably apply to Savage raiding. And while the warrior's invulnerability only prevents you from dying, the short 4-minute cooldown makes it extremely convenient in any scenario where you might need it multiple times. Because of how the warrior's rotation is somewhat open and more of a priority system, the biggest complexities come from planning your resources for bigger bursts, and then there's the opener. The basic opener makes very good sense and does have a slightly faster start if needed, if you have a faster GCD, but it is situationally relevant. However, the warrior does have some other openers. Let's just say that any opener that involves using Inner Release before you pull is considered a cursed opener, and should only be used if you know for certain you need to use it. This of course adds the complexity to the warrior that you need to know which fights this happens to apply to be perfectly optimal. However, overall, I believe the warrior perfectly encapsulates the playstyle you'd hope and expect a warrior to have. Simple, not a lot of mashing and thinking ahead, and of course, axe go brings us to the next job, Dark Knight. Replacing the big axe with a big sword for that FF7 cloud feel, and the light with darkness, the Dark Knight is opposite to both Paladin and Warrior. In terms of attack rotation, the Dark Knight feels a lot like a much faster paced take on the Warrior style, with Delirium being functionally similar to Inner Release. Additionally, paired with the Dark Knight having just the single 1-2-3 combo to fill in when nothing else, Bloodspiller namely, is available. Early on, the Dark Knight depends on MP to do most of the oGCD attacks it has access to, and then, as it levels up, adds more and more and more and more and more oGCD attacks to deal with. Due to their cooldowns, most of these attacks are planned to be used during raid buffs, which causes the biggest difficulty of the job to be dealing with, well, using all of that within 15 or so seconds every 2 minutes, while also dealing with things the boss throws your way. This kind of frantic burst applies even at lower levels, although other jobs are less likely to have raid cooldowns for you to make use of. However, that still means you can practice this endgame strategy from the very start. Because the Dark Knight stacks all of its attacks into one big burst every minute, and especially every 2 minutes, it means the downtime between these bursts are much less tense, at times consisting of just using your 1-2-3 combos. Stockpiling MP and blood gauge without wasting any excess becomes the mantra of the downtime periods. Beyond the complexity of the burst combos, the Dark Knight also can further optimize by timing their signature defensive cooldown, the Blackest Night. to be able to stockpile an additional 3000 MP for their burst. Speaking of defensive cooldowns, the Dark Knight's tools are heavily focused on magic damage reduction, and the Blackest Night shield making the tank particularly strong in fights where there is a heavy preference for magic damage. The Blackest Night can then be combined with Oblation for a very strong cooldown for your co-tank as needed. But the main thing Dark Knights lack are reliable healing options. It's almost like all of the healing budget of the Dark Knight was placed in their somewhat recently buffed invulnerability, Living Dead, which makes the Dark Knight capable of healing for far more than even the Warrior, but only in an extremely short time frame and only in deathly scenarios. Nonetheless, the big complexity of the Dark Knight comes from its opener and bursts on even minutes, which involve cramming around 14 oGCDs into a 15-second burst window, and then managing the resource stockpiling in between these bursts. For the most part, they're pretty honest and upfront and don't really deal in cursed openers at all. However, albeit a bit late, they have access to both the Shadowbringer named Attack and Oblation, which makes you pose like in that Shadowbringers expansion trailer, so if you really want to show your love for that, Dark Knight is your guy. Or girl. You know what I mean. Which finally leads us to Gunbreaker, the tank that almost tricked people into thinking it was a DPS. A very unique visual style with both slashes and explosions, the weight combined with the shorter size of the gunblade logically explaining why a tank might carry a weapon in just one hand, while keeping the other free to hold onto the gunblade when the pressure of the explosions makes it necessary. The Gunbreaker is extremely upfront with how its attack rotation works. In fact, surprisingly few things get added to it as you level up. The general gist of it is use everything during No Mercy, and then a bit later use a few things, leading to a big burst and a small burst. Once you get Bloodfest, this leads to an alternation that goes huge burst, small burst, big burst, small burst, repeat. While this very specific rotation makes Gunbreaker somewhat comparable to the Paladin, who also alternates between big magic and smaller physical bursts, the fact that the Gunbreaker's bursts are filled entirely with downtime rotation somehow makes it a lot less rigid than the Paladin. In some ways, the amount of oGCD actions the Gunbreaker gets makes it a lot more comparable to the Dark Knight. And incidentally, both of these jobs tend to be much better at maximizing their burst within the raid cooldowns in comparison to Warrior and Paladin, making them slightly stronger in terms of raw damage output, at least at the moment. Essentially, the Gunbreaker style revolves around stockpiling resources and then bursting it all in one big explosion every minute, over 20 seconds. And because a few of the cooldowns work on only 30-second cooldowns instead of 60, they get an extra go in between. In terms of defensive tools, the Gunbreaker thrives on having some extra long duration ones with a shorter cooldown, and their shortest one even comes with a heal that is specifically only activated when it is needed, making it optimal to throw out almost on cooldown for the free healing. Having Aurora for even more healing makes Gunbreaker the best contestant to compete with Warrior as a fellow green tank as well. The biggest complexity of the Gunbreaker comes from its No Mercy burst windows, which, while extremely straightforward, just use everything, can be very difficult to perform, since you need to both properly lateweave No Mercy and then also be able to get to everything in those 20 seconds. This means around 8 to 9 specifically planned out GCDs, which means you have 16 or 18 oGCD slots to fit 8 or more oGCDs, which, again, sounds very manageable, but in practice can be somewhat stressful. There is also the extra factor of making sure you plan the heaviest hitters among them in the window where the other raid cooldowns are, even if No Mercy will be the single biggest contributor on its own. In terms of openers, the fact that Gunbreakers cannot start with a full powder gauge means that, try as you might, the opener will be a little easier to manage than the big bursts that follow every 2 minutes. But every burst is very similar in game plan. Use everything. While the Gunbreaker has no specific demands to their skill speed amounts, there is a difference between having no skill speed and having some skill speed, namely whether you do 8 or 9 GCDs in the No Mercy window. Both are absolutely viable, so just like Warrior and Dark Knight, you can to some degree freely choose what skill speed you like. Finally, somehow, the Gunbreaker combines the Warrior and Paladin invulnerabilities by dropping to 1 HP and then becoming completely impervious to damage. Whether bonking yourself on the head for invulnerability is an advantage sort of depends on the individual encounter. To round up this comparison, each tank clearly has some specific sort of draw to play it for. Dark Knight and Gunbreaker tend to be more popular for their DPS-like feel, while Paladin tends to draw an audience from its toolkit of last resort options, as well as being the mage tank and the sword and board tank. Warrior draws its audience often from, ironically, being more mellow and less intense, while also having some extremely reliable defensive cooldowns to keep you alive. In fact, so much so that Warrior tends to be preferable for soloing old content. For a new player wanting to pick up tanking for the first time, I would absolutely recommend Warrior due to its simplicity. On the other hand, I would heavily advise against picking up Gunbreaker as your first tank, both because of its entry-level complexity with its no mercy bursts, making it difficult to focus on learning tanking, but also because it starts at level 60, pitting you against harder fights right away. Either way, choose a tank that you enjoy the most, for all of them are viable in all content. Even if one does slightly more DPS than the others, they are all perfectly capable of doing what needs to be done. And that leads us to the ending of this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this comparison or even found it funny or interesting, please consider leaving a like. You can also subscribe and taunt the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And make sure to remember to let me know in the comments which tank is your favorite. Fun fact, back in Stormblood, and perhaps before that, a strange thing that made the three tanks at the time stand apart was that the Paladin needed to use oGCD to switch between its damage stance and its tanking stance. The Dark Knight only needed oGCD to switch into the tank stance, while the Warrior could technically freely switch between them, but I do believe it came at the cost of cleaning out their beast gauge if I recall correctly. A very strange point to differentiate on, don't you think?